Across the year, I've been discussing my thoughts on each of the Sixth Doctor's TV stories, and now I've decided to compile them all and rank them in the order which I consider to be worst to best. I hope you enjoyed this video, but before we get into the ranking, I'd just like to ask, if you haven't already, I would greatly appreciate it if you supported the channel by hitting subscribe, turning on notifications, liking, comment your ranking of the Sixth Doctor TV stories in the comments below, and you can find and follow me on social media at the links here. As one of the very first classic Who stories I ever saw, I do hold some degree of nostalgia for Time Lash, but I do have to concede it's easily the weakest of the Sixth Doctor's run. The story itself is just probably one of the more average plots we've ever gotten from Doctor Who. I think what makes it so infamous is not only the poor visual design, but some of the performances from the guest cast are pretty wooden. Paul Darrow, of course, is great, and I like the design of the Borad. However, you can definitely tell with Colin and Nicola all the behind-the-scenes issues they were having. Their frustration is very apparent in their performances, combined with the weakest characterization for them. While it's undeniably not a strong story overall, I've got to give it props for its creativity in regards to the post-regenerative story and the arc it sets up for the Sixth Doctor. We really get to see Colin Baker's acting range as he goes through several contrasting emotions, sometimes within the same scene. The problem with the Twin Dilemma lies in the fact that it doesn't prioritise this plot, instead focusing on the far less interesting Mestor and Twins storyline, which is just a bit confusing and realistically should have either been dropped or severely downplayed, as the Sixth Doctor story is far more interesting. Probably the most average story of the Sixth Doctor's run. While Twin Dilemma has more interesting ideas, this one's a more consistently solid story overall. It's always nice to have historicals, especially in the 80s when they become a lot more rare. This is a decent introduction to the Rani, though it never really gets much better than this story for her. And while it's a bit more calm than usual, there is some more subtle body horror here, which is a bit more disturbing only when you sort of stop to think about it, particularly the fate of Luke. It might seem a bit silly on initial viewing, but the more you think about it, the more disturbing the connotations are. Okay, for this one, I will concede that there are some issues with the story, but I still love it as probably a guilty pleasure. It's great to see the Second Doctor and Jamie back, and I think Jamie alongside the Sixth Doctor and Perry is a pretty underrated dynamic, and I'm kind of sad that Fraser Hines didn't stick around. I know that wouldn't have made sense, but there's a lot of plot holes in the story already, so I don't think the Sontarans are as bad as a lot of people say. Not to mention, I really appreciate the use of location filming. It really helps to break things up visually. Probably the second best story of the season. I don't enjoy it as much due to the fact that the Sixth Doctor and Perry don't have that much to do in part 1. The rest of the cast is pretty good, and I appreciate they spent time giving us an opportunity to get to know all of these characters and make us care or hate them. Probably one of the best of Terry Malloy's performances, and Colin really gets to shine in part 2 when he bounces off Davros. Probably the best Dr. Davros dynamic since Genesis, and there are some pretty great dark comedic moments here. This is probably Saward's best script in my opinion. Despite how much fan service and references there are in this story, Attack of the Cybermen does a good job at standing out on its own and creating its own identity. It has some of the most brutal sequences of violence in the entire show. I think it's interesting that they also did a redemption arc for a villain. That's quite rare. It's interesting to see Lytton go from a fairly one-note mercenary to an actual character. While we're still quite early on in the Sixth Doctor's arc, it's great to see just how much he's grown from Twin Dilemma after just one story. Easily one of the best stories of this era, and just a great story in its own right. The social commentary is surprisingly topical and holds up really well. You can actually see its influence in stories like Parting of the Ways. Syl is probably one of the last great recurring villains of the classic series, and Nabil Shaban does a fantastic slimy performance. It also gives the Sixth Doctor more of an opportunity to be a heroic figure. I think compared to how dark everything else is, he's given the opportunity to be a bit more calm than usual, because in contrast to all the terrible stuff going on, he looks much better here. Probably a controversial opinion, but I think Trial of a Time Lord, in its entirety, is easily the best story of Colin Baker's TV run. This is the one which really deep dives into the Sixth Doctor's character, with each segment of the trial offering an opportunity to explore certain aspects of his character, setting him on the path of letting him know that he really needs to start changing his ways before it's too late, and we get to see him face the consequences of his neglectful nature of Perry, and really demonstrates how he wishes to become a better person, and by the end of it he is ready to start evolving and mellowing out, which we get to see across Big Finish. It definitely demonstrates that the main issue with Colin's run is simply the fact that it wasn't allowed to have its natural conclusion where he gets to complete his arc, but here at least it sets him on the path for growth. Alongside that, it's just generally a great story with a strong cast, probably my favourite score out of any era of the show. I really like Dominic Glenn's music, some great dark moments. I love this story.